The Cosmic Skeptic a while back released a video talking about Jordan Peterson's views on God and the nature of reality. And I think he did a pretty good job of communicating his own ideas and trying to decipher Jordan Peterson's perspective, which is kind of infamously confusing. I enjoy a lot of Cosmic Skeptic or Alex O'Connor's work, but honestly I thought that this video was very off base and misrepresented a lot of what Jordan Peterson talks about, and hopefully I can straighten some things out in this video. Jordan Peterson's view on God is an unbelievably complicated topic, the product of thousands of hours of reading and a career as a clinician and researcher. For years, his perspective has confused me a ton. Even after reading his book, Maps of Meaning, I found myself struggling with his conceptions of reality, and especially his conception of God. It really wasn't until I got into graduate school and took some classes under a professor who, I kid you not, sounded almost identical to Jordan Peterson. It wasn't until then that I started to understand his perspective and the depth of it. My professor was heavily influenced by guys like Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, and Friedrich Nietzsche, and other lesser-known philosophers like William James, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Ludwig Wittgenstein. After dozens of books, a handful of classes, and hundreds of hours of studying, my experiences over the last year has constellated, in my opinion, in a better understanding of Jordan Peterson's perspective, and that's what I want to communicate in this video. So, essential thesis of Cosmic Skeptic's video is that Jordan Peterson, by the general use of the term, is an atheist, affirming that God is in fact a figment of our imagination.
Jordan Peterson is what most people would call an atheist. He thinks that God is a fictional character, that the stories of religious scripture did not literally occur, and that the idea of God and stories about him are primarily a way for people to ground their value structures and provide social and psychological unity.
I too held this position regarding Jordan Peterson at one point, and Cosmic Skeptic's questions and analysis is very reminiscent of my own at that time, and that's why I want to use his video as something to kind of bounce off of. We'll get into the details of why this is incorrect later on in the video, but the main thing that it has to do with is the devaluation of imagination or fantasy or metaphor, something that Jordan Peterson is especially against. He holds metaphor to be the highest form of truth, that it grounds our literal experience of reality. And so it goes metaphor, then these literal truths. We'll get more on that in a moment, but let's start by answering the first question that Cosmic Skeptic proposes, and what is God, according to Jordan Peterson?
For Peterson, the very ability to even identify a cup as a distinguishable object requires a belief in certain values.
If you were a photorealist painter, you could spend a month painting all the reflections on that glass. It's a very complex thing to perceive, but you perceive it as a unity, and we know this neuropsychologically, we know this scientifically. You perceive it as a unity because you can grip it, and because you can raise it to your lips, and because you can drink it, and because you need to drink water to survive, and you are willing to drink water to survive because you believe emotionally and motivationally and perhaps rationally that survival is a good, and that's dependent on your belief that human existence in some sense is a good, and that it's striving towards some sort of higher unified order. And you might think, well, you don't need all that to perceive the glass. And the answer is, yeah, as a matter of fact, you need all of that to perceive the glass.
So here we are introduced to the famous Jordan Peterson value hierarchy. As Alex shows in the video, according to Jordan Peterson, a value hierarchy is required to ground a certain perspective of reality. You can even go a step further and say that it's required in order to ground a certain experience of reality. At the top of this value hierarchy ultimately lies certain beliefs that ground the rest of it. If true, this fundamentally shifts so much that we know about science and the scientific method and reality itself. So in this video, he proposes a rather basic example of how these beliefs that are at the top of the hierarchy can influence ones later down. I want to take a look at a few others. The first one we're going to consider is eating disorders. So the most common theory regarding eating disorders is that they are purely cultural phenomena stemming from the idealization of thin body types. In other words, in cultures where thin body types are not idealized, eating disorders do not exist or are extremely rare. So we'll get more into this in a moment, but we can see that a cultural fixation, a cultural belief, a cultural value can actually influence the people's psychology and especially their psychopathologies. What's extremely fascinating in the case of eating disorders is that this ultimately results in misperceptions of reality in a few different ways. First is that when people look in the mirror who have eating disorders, they won't see what everybody else sees. they'll see a person who is larger. This misperception even extends into their own awareness of their body in space, called proprioception. In a very interesting experiment, individuals diagnosed with eating disorders were instructed to draw an outline of their body in chalk, and then there's a control group who didn't have eating disorders who did the same thing. And on average, the individuals diagnosed with eating disorders drew the chalk outline of themselves significantly larger than they actually were. So in this case, the value of thinness, when idealized or placed at the top of an individual's value hierarchy, results in a different, in this case, pathological experience of reality. Another even more impactful example comes from one of the most detailed studies of the evolution of art in Western cultures. This comes from the book Faces, The Changing Look of Humankind by Milton Brenner. In this book, Milton details a massive shift in art history, from paintings and sculptures with almost no facial detail to paintings that have a ton of facial detail. Furthermore, in poetry and narrative, there's a shift from nearly zero discussion of facial expression to many examples of faces become the focal point of a story or a verse. According to psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist, the rise of values such as uniqueness, independence, personal autonomy, and individuality in ancient Greece resulted in this shift. Perhaps another extremely powerful example of how values at the top of a value hierarchy can fundamentally alter our perception and experience of reality. In this case, literally changing the way we perceive others' faces. This obviously begs the question, what lies at the top of culture's value hierarchy?
We could say, well, the highest place is the divine place, and we could make that a matter of definition.
The highest place, that is, the highest place on this value hierarchy that we were just talking about, is the divine place, and we can make that a matter of definition. Wow. The word divine, of course, means of or relating to God. And Peterson has just told us that for him, it's a simple matter of definition that the divine is just whatever value is at the highest place on the value hierarchy.
This divine seat at the top of our value hierarchy, according to Jordan Peterson, is oftentimes encapsulated in things like mythology and personified as figures such as gods.
Well, how do we characterize it? I would say we characterize that using fiction, because fiction is the abstraction of hierarchies of attentional prioritization and action. And so we could say that in the highest sense, in the biblical corpus, God is the ultimate fictional character.
Now from here, in my opinion, Cosmic Skeptic makes a huge error in the devaluation of fantasy, attributing it to just inventions of the human mind.
God is the fictional personification of the highest value held by human beings. This is the proof. Jordan Peterson is an atheist. He's just described God as a fictional character whose existence is simply a characterization of value made by the human mind for the purpose of uniting us psychologically and socially. This is exactly what atheists say. God does not exist except as he is invented by the human mind. And the reason why the human mind invents God is to provide some psychological and social stability. If this is not atheism, then what is?
So here's the final characterization that Cosmic Skeptic gives Jordan Peterson's God.
What he's really talking about is something like the fundamental value that human beings hold, whatever is at the top of their value hierarchy.
So in other words, Jordan Peterson's God is a metaphorical representation of the highest cultural values. Now, honestly, I have no problem with this definition at all. However, a more nuanced understanding of metaphor, mythology, and narrative will illuminate the importance of this characterization and emphasize the difference between it and the general use of the term atheism. So let's take a closer look at Jordan Peterson's understanding of these metaphorical narratives. This is exactly where Cosmic Skeptic turns his attention to as well.
Did the events in Exodus really happen? And our conclusion was, well, not only did they happened in a meta manner, they're still happening.
Okay.
They happened they happened with such reality that they haven't stopped happening. And what does that mean? Well, everyone still struggles with the spirit of tyranny. And everyone still struggles with the fact that when you escape from a tyranny, you don't hit the promised land, you hit the desert. It didn't happen the way a happening would occur if you just detailed it out as a camera holding empirical observer. It happened in a way deeper way that just doesn't stop happening.
So when asked, did the Exodus really happen, Peterson says, it's still happening. What?
CosmicSkeptic's reaction here kind of shows that he's unfamiliar in the way in which Jordan Peterson is communicating, this kind of metaphorical substrate kind of thing. So obviously in this, Jordan Peterson is proposing a very different understanding of the biblical narrative, one that I believe is more supported by evidence, but that's for a different video. His perspective is that these stories are like snapshots of what he calls a layer of meta-truths. This obviously begs the question, it's a very frustrating question. How could something be meta-true? How could something be more true than true? Well, here's the answer. It's that which dictates truth is by necessity more true than true. Now remember the examples I brought up previously, how the values of thinness changes the perception of those with eating disorders, and how the values relating to individuality change the perceptions of our faces. However, the mechanism that is responsible for these alterations can be considered meta-true, as it dictates what is true. It dictates our experience of reality. Furthermore, this must be encapsulated using metaphorical language, because ultimately reality is constantly changing. If something is to be universally meaningful, then it has to be fluid, or else it can't apply to new situations. So I'm sure this sounds bizarre, as it does to most people and did to me when I first learned about it. So one of the best things that helped me understand Jordan Peterson's perspective is to look at it through the lens of neuroscience. I think this gives us a little bit more concrete terms and a concrete thing to bounce the ideas off of. So the brain experiences metaphor in a very unique way. Unlike that of the regular language, which is mediated by the left hemisphere, metaphor activates the right hemisphere. And if the right hemisphere is deactivated, you literally can't understand the metaphorical truth within a metaphor. As you're probably aware, the left hemisphere also deals with logic, reason, analytical problem solving, sequential thinking, and kind of consciousness in general, or another term would be the ego. The right hemisphere deals with, as I mentioned, metaphor, religious experience, poetry, music, meditation, intuition, and the unconscious in general. Now let's take a look at an example metaphor to hopefully make this a little bit more concrete. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. You immediately understand this to be a symbolic or metaphorical statement, again, mediated by that right hemisphere. This is an intuitive and automatic process. And if you think about it, there's a real complex and large meaning behind these words that is not explicitly stated in the passage, but you nonetheless grasp. And I would even argue that you can't fully explain the metaphor using other words. So now let's consider this again. How can this metaphor be meta-true? How can anything be meta-true? We'll take this example. Academic success requires intellectual struggle. Or this one, wealth only comes to those who persevere through adversity. In both cases, you can see the relation of these statements to the previous one, but they are more concrete. They are limited versions of the original metaphor. This illustrates the potential that resides within metaphorical language. There are an unlimited amounts of application for the mother metaphor. The metaphor in this case is incorporating a different way of understanding the world, a different engagement with reality that is much more fluid, much more dynamic, and has a much larger scope or breadth. Additionally, the original metaphor becomes the prism through which the others are refracted. So the original metaphor, being a tree, holds significance, and it's going to influence our ability to make the connections between the original metaphor and the new sayings or statements. Because of that top-down influence, it exerts a similar impact that top values do in Jordan Peterson's value hierarchy. The original metaphor influences the understanding of the derivative statements. So when we analyze the world from the left hemisphere's perspective, we ask these questions that CosmicSkeptic is asking and many other people, and we're right to ask them. Are these events literal? Did they historically happen? Is there physical evidence to prove any of it? But we have to realize that this is from that left hemisphere's perspective because it wants concrete knowledge so they can support our own survival. But ultimately, this is discounting the right hemisphere's perspective of reality, which, as illustrated above, has value. In fact, evidence suggests that it's not just valuable, but in fact primary to the construction of reality. That the world of the left hemisphere is a cut up, repurposed world that the right hemisphere has already grasped. This echoes a clip from Jordan Peterson talking about the differences between the hemispheres.
And we're going to say, well, reality is what selects for the sake of argument. Our neurological structures and our physical structures should be adapted to that reality. It's a necessary conclusion from that. So then the question is, well, are they? And as far as I can tell, the answer to that is yes. And so we'll go through the neuropsychological evidence quite
rapidly. The first bit of evidence is that you have two hemispheres. Why? One deals with the unknown and the other deals with the known.
So I won't exhaust all the relevant ways in which the hemisphere exerts primacy, but here are a few. So the first and most obvious one is the primacy of attention. As illustrated in this image, broad attention is experienced before the left hemisphere can take over and look at things in more detail. You notice the large lettering before the smaller constituents of that lettering. It is also similar to what Jordan Peterson said previously, that the right hemisphere of the brain is kind of on alert for something new, something immediate. And the left hemisphere takes the world that the right hemisphere has grasped and cuts it up into pieces to further understand it. So you have that unknown, known kind of divide that he was talking about. Second is the primacy of the implicit, and this was shown in the previous example metaphor. While reading it, you weren't thinking about a literal tree and the roots. You didn't read it like that at all. You can go back and read it like that, but it's the intuitive understanding that came to you first. The metaphorical understanding came to you first, again, mediated by the right hemisphere. Third is the primacy of affect. There's a lot of evidence that suggests our emotional response to things occur prior to our reasonable and logical responses to those things. And this is not only true from an experiential perspective, it's true from a developmental or evolutionary perspective. According to Ian McGilchrist, the areas of our brain that were previously dedicated to emotional reasoning or emotional response and understanding lay the foundation. They are the bedrock of the parts of our brain that actually deal with reason. So it seems like reason has evolved out of emotion, and it's more of a way to guide emotion than it is this transcendent capacity to get rid of emotion. The final area of primacy I'll mention is the primacy of the unconscious will. If I flash an image of a list of words on a screen, your eyes will be attracted to a specific word or phrase, and this process is non-random. According to research, there was background processing in your mind that was unconscious that analyzed that page before you consciously could and directed your attention to a word. This is also the data that people oftentimes use to support the idea that we don't have free will, because there's unconscious processing that occurs before the decision is consciously experienced. But a simple way to reframe this is that, we may not be in fact limited by the laws or dictated by the laws of nature. We might be dictated by the laws of the unconscious. It seems to me like in that argument, people are forgetting that the unconscious mind is still part of them. And just because it's going through the processing first doesn't mean it's not you. As you have most likely noticed by now, the relationship between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, or the conscious and unconscious mind, and literal and metaphorical truths have massive implications for scientific knowledge, and this is where we turn our attention to next.
Then I was thinking, well, what's the precondition for being a scientist? And I thought, well, in some sense, it's a there's deistic preconditions, because one of the things that characterizes scientists, and this includes people like Dawkins, who's a real scientist, is that the scientist presumes axiomatically that there's a transcendent realm outside the domain of epistemological theory. I believe in the transcendent if you're a scientist. And the answer is, well, not only do you believe in it, you believe in it more than anything else, because if you're a scientist, you believe in what objects to your theory more than you believe in your theory. Now, we got to think that through very carefully. So your theory describes the world, and as far as you're concerned, your description of the world is the world. But because you're a scientist, you think, well, even though that's my description of the world and that's what I believe, there's something beyond what I believe. And that's the object. And so I'm going to throw my theory against the object and see where it'll break.
So to the naked eye, this sounds ridiculous coming from a scientist, literally a scientist like Jordan Peterson. This sounds bizarre.
A scientist does not think that their description of the world is the world. They think it accurately describes part of how the world functions. Indeed, to be a good scientist at all, a scientist has to understand that there does exist a world beyond their current scientific description to be explored and tested against. So to say that a scientist thinks that their theory is the world in its totality is totally wrong and quite bizarre.
So this tension that CosmicSkeptic and Jordan Peterson are talking about really relates to this idea that scientific truths are always to be questioned. And my understanding is that is the extent of the point that Jordan Peterson is making. So this, I believe, personally is best understood through the hemispheric lens. This is how it made sense to me. As mentioned previously, the left hemisphere is the hemisphere of reason, logic, sequential thinking, and its coordination is the scientific process. But the right hemisphere also contributes to the scientific process. The right hemisphere, as mentioned before, is the hemisphere of variability, fluidity, and vitality. It sees things as dynamic and ever-changing. It also holds on to no assumptions when it looks at reality. So the idea is that the right hemisphere is holding on to the grand scheme of things, where the left hemisphere is taking things apart and analyzing everything. And so the grand scheme here is that science is moving in a direction that is really the unknown, but it's kind of assumed to exist, that there's a better model to understand reality. But even that model will not be sufficient. There'll be a better model than that one. And this is that fluid aspect of the right hemisphere kind of rearing its head in the scientific methodology. So I want to focus in a little bit more on this idea of mythology and religion. So the right hemisphere, if you want to say the unconscious mind's mode of cognition and experience of reality, is oftentimes incorporated in these religious texts. In fact, one of the most surefire ways to experience the world from this angle is during altered states of consciousness, which is another term for activation of unconscious areas of your brain, or deactivation of conscious areas of the brain. This can be done not just using psychedelics, but in meditative prayer. It can be done in meditation, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, certain chants and drumming and things like that. And in these religious experiences, people experience religious imagery. People describe things such as ego death, which is dimming of the left hemisphere, where you feel like you don't have an identity. People also experience things that they're incapable of putting into words, instead having to use metaphor to explain them. And these experiences are oftentimes accompanied by feelings of bliss, unity, and oneness with reality. Again, kind of echoing that right hemisphere perspective. According to Ian McGilchrist in his book, The Master and His Emissary, the overarching metaphor is the master has his emissary and the emissary turns on the master and enslaves him. And the emissary is the left hemisphere, that though the left hemisphere is subordinate to the right hemisphere, it takes the position as almost a tyrant in our own minds. And I think that this is the common perspective, and we can't help but have this perspective. Even for me, when I think of fantasy, when I think of, imaginative experiences, art, poetry, there's a sense that it is not capable of really adding to the conversation of how we understand reality. I think this can be seen in CosmicSkeptic's own rhetoric and his devaluation of metaphorical truths. This whole thing kind of reminds me of Eastern traditions, and people in the East tend to rely more heavily on their right hemisphere. And a big part of Eastern traditions is dampening that ego. Again, it could be seen as taking the tyrant in our mind kind of down a few levels. So the question really becomes, do myth, metaphor, symbolism, and religious tradition have any capacity to contribute to our understanding of reality? Is metaphor a means to acquiring truth? In summary, our experience of reality is heavily influenced by unconscious, right hemisphere-based analysis of the world. The presentation of information from our right hemisphere is characteristically irrational, yet it's also primary, and in some cases better equipped to identify truth claims than the left hemisphere. Jordan Peterson's God relies on the experience of the right hemisphere, or unconsciousness, resulting in a more dynamic, fluid, metaphorical definition of God, but not one that is less true. Most see his definition of God as irrational and illogical because it's being analyzed by the left hemisphere, which brings its own biases and errors. So let me leave you with a quote by one of Jordan Peterson's biggest influences, Carl Jung. And I think it really emphasizes this idea that we're rooted in the perspective of the left hemisphere, and there comes challenges with that. It is only through the psyche that we can establish that God acts upon us, but we are unable to distinguish whether these actions emanate from God or from the unconscious. We cannot tell whether God and the unconscious are two different identities. So perhaps we're stuck, ultimately, not knowing the answer. If you're interested in learning more, be sure to subscribe and let me know what you think down in the comment section below. I will see you guys on the next one.